Okay, I'm very pleased to be here, but the message I have to deliver is not a pleasant message. My message is that violence is a highly contagious disease. It's a little different from other diseases, contagious diseases, in that you don't need to be near someone who is infected with it to catch it. It can be caught by exposure at a distance, but it can be just as deadly if caught at a distance as if caught up close. The more violent people you are exposed to, the more likely you are to catch violence. And just like many other diseases, repeated exposures to even one infected person make it more likely that you will catch violence. Of course, physical contact with a violent person in the form of violent victimization increases even more the risk of infection. But physical contact or victimization is not necessary. Violence is also like many other diseases in that many individuals have characteristics that enhance their resistance to this disease, so they don't catch it despite repeated exposures. However, other people have characteristics that make them more susceptible to being infected when they're exposed to violence, so they more easily catch it. And certainly, one of the characteristics that makes people more susceptible is youth. Of course, like some other diseases, violence also can develop spontaneously in individuals who have never been exposed to violence. For example, in individuals who have certain abnormalities or grow up in certain kinds of facilitative environments or who are genetically predisposed in certain ways. But the risk for these individuals can also be increased by exposure to other violent individuals. Obviously, the processes through which one becomes infected with violence must be neurological and psychological, as one can be infected at a distance. But what are they? The name most often associated with these processes was offered over 50 years ago by Stanford University researcher Albert Bandura. He called them observational learning. In the 50 years since, we have learned a lot about observational learning. It includes multiple processes, including imitation of behaviors, acquisition of cognitive scripts, acquisition of schemas about the world, acquisition of normative and moral beliefs, and emotional habituation to violence. Neuroscientists have discovered specific neurons called mirror neurons, which seem to promote observational learning. Through research like that of Andrew Meltzoff, we have discovered that human infants mimic in the first few weeks of life and imitate, that is, reproduce observed behaviors later in the first few months of life. We have also learned that observational learning is an automatic process. It does not need to be consciously controlled. Given these facts, it is not at all surprising that social behavior, including violent behavior, is contagious. Yet often people have difficulty accepting this fact, particularly if the exposure to violence is caused by situations that seemingly have benefits for some. Wars of liberation, maintaining public order, entertainment, or making money. In the remainder of my brief talk, I want to present some scientific data that shows that both exposure to real violence in the real world and exposure to simulated violence in the media world can infect the person who is being exposed with violence. I'm going to present just a few specific examples of studies, but you should understand that the accumulated data from the many studies over the past half century have been reviewed with numerous meta-analyses and have shown substantial effect sizes on a scale of 0 to 1. The effect sizes for infection from observing to violence range from about 0.2 for most field studies to about 0.4 for laboratory studies. These may not seem large, but I'm sure most of you realize these are in the range of many other significant public health threats. Let me begin with an example of the contagion of community violence in Chicago. In the 1990s, supported by NIH and CDC, I and my colleagues Nancy Guerra and Pat Tolan examined over 4,000 6 to 11-year-old youth growing up in very high-risk neighborhoods over 6 years. We interviewed them every year and interviewed their peers in school. We asked their peers about who was always getting into fights and hitting others. The next slide, this slide, shows what we found. The best predictor of aggressive and violent behavior in any year was aggressive and violent behavior in the prior year. But beyond that, the kids who saw more neighborhood violence in the prior year behaved more aggressively in the next year. And this was not due to more aggressive kids exposing themselves to more violence. Let me turn now to another study. This one of children's exposure to war violence. Over the past 5 years, I and my colleagues have been repeatedly interviewing a random sample of 600 Palestinian children and 500 Israeli children who are exposed to horrific scenes of terrorism and war violence. The children were 8, 11, or 14 when we started our study. The amount of exposure for some children was appalling. For example, 28% of Palestinian 8-year-olds reported seeing someone killed in front of them. Of course, some children were exposed to more violence and some to less violence. As the next slide shows, we found clear evidence that the children who were exposed to more war violence in the first 2 years caught the violence and behaved violently towards their own peers in the 3rd year. Severe physical aggression means beating up, punching or choking, or even using a gun or knife or threatening to use a gun or knife against their peers. High violence exposures means the upper 25%. Again, we were also able to show that the relation is not due to more aggressive youth exposing themselves to more violence in the next year. Furthermore, you should realize that these own youth are behaving violently towards their own peers, not towards the people who perpetrated the violence. But now let's turn to exposure to a different kind of violence, simulated violence in the mass media. Can a youth be infected with violence from repeated exposure to this kind of violence? The answer is yes. Because of the vast amounts of money involved in the mass media and the fact that everyone is exposed to some violence in the mass media, this has become a much more controversial topic. But the neurological and psychological processes that cause youth to be infected with violence when they see violence around them in the real world do not suddenly stop operating because the violence is viewed on the electronic media. This effect is illustrated with a study I and my colleagues began in Chicago area in the late 1970s. We interviewed and tested 800 first and 8th grade children living in Oak Park, Illinois, about the TV violence they were watching in this period, and then we interviewed them 15 years later when they're in their 20s. As this slide shows, the boys and girls who were repeatedly watching more TV violence when they were 6 to 10 years old were more aggressive young adults. Again, with statistical analyses, we could also rule out that the effect was due to more aggressive 6 to 10-year-olds turning to watching more violent TV. But what about violent video games, a current topic? Recently, I and my colleague Brad Bushman have conducted a 3-year longitudinal study of over 800 second and 4th graders in Michigan. What did we find? As the next slide shows, we found that the kids who were regularly playing more violent video games in the first 2 years of the study were hitting others more in the last year of the study. Again, we were able to rule out statistically that this was due to more aggressive kids playing more violent video games. And what about real delinquents and real criminals? Are their violent behaviors influenced at all by their exposure to violence earlier in life, particularly media violence? This is more difficult to study with a prospective longitudinal study, but we do have some data on it. The next slide shows data from a sample of about 800 adjudicated delinquents and high-risk high school students in Michigan. Those whose delinquent behaviors were more violent had a history of more exposure to violence in the mass media, according to retrospective reports. Finally, we found similar data on a sample of prisoners in Indiana. The retrospective reports of media use during childhood showed that a significant predictor of whether a person was imprisoned for a violent or nonviolent offense was how much exposure to media violence they had in childhood. In fact, you can see the odds ratio was, standardized odds ratio was 1.8. 80% more risk of being imprisoned for violent than nonviolent crime if they had one standard deviation higher exposure to media violence. Okay. In summary, violence is contagious. Many factors, genetic, physiological, environmental, contribute to individual differences in the propensity to behave violently. However, one key factor is clearly how much violence, real world or media world, a youth has been exposed to during his or her childhood. Thank you.